The avoidant person genuinely recognizes they're lucky to have you. They understand on some level that you are an exceptional partner who sees them deeply and accepts them fully and offers them exactly what their wounded heart needs. They know intellectually that most people would never find someone who provides the understanding, the patience, and the safety that you provide. They feel in moments of clarity that having you in their life is a gift they don't deserve and should cherish. But despite this recognition, despite genuinely feeling fortunate to have you, they cannot stay with you, cannot sustain the relationship, and cannot overcome the internal barriers that make closeness with you feel unbearable, regardless of how intellectually aware they are of your value and their luck in having found you. This painful contradiction, recognizing you're incredible while being unable to be with you, is not evidence that they're lying about feeling lucky or that they don't actually value you. It is evidence of how profoundly their childhood trauma, their attachment wounds, and their deep-seated fears about love and intimacy override their intellectual recognition of what's good for them. It shows how their defensive patterns and their emotional conditioning are stronger than their awareness or their conscious desires. It demonstrates how psychological damage from early experiences creates involuntary responses that destroy relationships they consciously value and drive away people they intellectually recognize as exceptional. The avoidant feels lucky to have you because you provide what they've always needed: unconditional acceptance, patience with their patterns, the ability to see their authentic self beneath their defenses, safety to be vulnerable without judgment, and understanding of their wounds without requiring them to be fixed immediately. And they recognize these qualities are rare and precious, and that most people would never tolerate their patterns with the grace you demonstrate. But the very closeness you create, the very intimacy your acceptance enables, the very vulnerability your safety invites, triggers their deepest fears and their most primitive defenses in ways they cannot control through willpower or through intellectual recognition of your value. Their trauma tells them that being loved means eventual abandonment, that being truly known means being rejected when the true self is revealed, that depending on someone means being hurt when that person proves unreliable, that vulnerability leads to pain, that closeness leads to loss of self. These trauma-based beliefs operate at a visceral, automatic level that bypasses intellectual understanding. They can know you're trustworthy while feeling you're threatening. They can recognize you're special while experiencing closeness with you as suffocating. They can feel lucky to have you while simultaneously feeling desperate to escape the intimacy you create. The tragedy is that what makes them feel lucky, your understanding, your acceptance, your creation of safety, is precisely what triggers their deepest wounds and their most intense fears, creating an impossible situation where the very person who could heal them is the person whose presence activates all their trauma responses and makes staying feel impossible despite their recognition of how fortunate they are to have found you. Why they genuinely recognize they're lucky to have you. The avoidant person's recognition that they're lucky to have you is genuine and is based on specific qualities and capacities they observe in you that they understand are rare and valuable. Understanding what makes them feel fortunate reveals both their awareness of your worth and the tragedy that this awareness isn't sufficient to overcome their trauma and enable them to stay. They recognize they're lucky because you see their authentic self beneath their defended exterior, and you don't reject what you see, but respond with compassion and understanding. The avoidant spends most of their life hiding their true self, showing only the independent, together facade while concealing their wounds, their needs, their fears, their vulnerabilities. Most people accept this surface presentation and never look deeper. Or if they do perceive the wounds beneath, they're repelled or judgmental. But you saw through their defenses. You recognize their patterns as protection mechanisms rather than as their true nature. You perceived their pain and their struggles. And rather than being repelled or judgmental, you responded with compassion. You understood why they are the way they are. You had empathy for their wounds. The avoidant recognizes this combination. Being truly seen and being accepted anyway is extraordinarily rare. Most people never get beneath their defenses, and the few who do typically reject what they find. You did both and remained, making them feel incredibly fortunate to have found someone capable of this depth of seeing and accepting. They recognize they're lucky because you're patient with their patterns in ways that most people would never tolerate, giving them space and chances that others wouldn't give. The avoidant knows their patterns are difficult. The hot and cold behavior, the withdrawal, the emotional unavailability, the need for space, the inconsistency. They know most people wouldn't tolerate this. Most people would get frustrated and leave early in the relationship, would refuse to accept treatment that's confusing and painful, would establish boundaries that the avoidant couldn't navigate. But you were patient. You tried to understand rather than immediately condemning. You gave space when they needed it. You gave multiple chances when they messed up. You tolerated behavior that others wouldn't tolerate. The avoidant recognizes this patience is a gift. That having someone willing to work with their patterns rather than immediately abandoning them is a fortunate circumstance that most avoidants never experience. They recognize they're lucky because you create safety that allows them to be vulnerable in ways they cannot be with others, providing the rare experience of feeling they could be themselves without judgment. The avoidant is typically unable to be vulnerable, unable to express needs or feelings, unable to let their guard down. But with you, they experience moments of vulnerability that they couldn't access with others. They could share things they usually hide, express feelings they normally suppress, and show needs they typically deny. This happened because you created safety. You didn't punish their vulnerability. You didn't use it against them. You didn't judge them for having needs or feelings. The avoidant recognizes this safety is precious and rare. That having a person with whom vulnerability is possible is a fortunate finding that many avoidants never experience because most relationships don't create the conditions where their defensive system relaxes enough to allow any vulnerability. They recognize they're lucky because you understand their wounds and their history without requiring them to be immediately healed or fixed, accepting them in their current state while believing in their potential. The avoidant is accustomed to people either not understanding their wounds at all or understanding them, but requiring immediate change, requiring them to get therapy right now, requiring them to be different than they are. But you offered a different approach. You understood their wounds and where they came from. You recognized the therapeutic work they needed to do, but you didn't require immediate transformation as a condition of being with them. You accepted them in their current wounded state while believing they had potential to grow and heal. This acceptance of their current reality while holding hope for their future is a rare balance that the avoidant recognizes as special. You neither ignored their need for growth nor demanded they be different immediately. And this middle path of acceptance plus belief in potential is a gift that makes them feel fortunate. They recognize they're lucky because you maintain your own worth and boundaries even while being patient, creating a dynamic where they respect you rather than devaluing you for accommodating them. The avoidant typically devalues people who are too accommodating, too willing to accept poor treatment, too flexible with boundaries. But you were different. You were patient and understanding, but you also maintained your worth. You set boundaries when necessary. You didn't lose yourself in their patterns. You called out behavior that crossed lines. This maintenance of your own worth while being patient created respect that prevented the devaluation that usually happens when people accommodate the avoidant too much. They recognize they're lucky to have found someone who could be both understanding and self-respecting, both patient and boundaried, creating a dynamic where they couldn't devalue you even while you were tolerating their patterns. They recognize they're lucky because you offer emotional depth and genuine intimacy that they've longed for even while fearing it, providing a taste of what a relationship could be if they could overcome their defenses. The avoidant, beneath their defended exterior, does long for genuine connection, for real intimacy, for depth of relationship. But they rarely experience this because their defenses prevent it. With you, they got glimpses of what they've always wanted. Moments of genuine emotional connection, experiences of real intimacy, depth of understanding and being understood. These glimpses showed them what's possible, what they're missing by living behind their walls. The avoidant recognizes they're lucky to have experienced this with you, to have tasted what they've longed for, even though the very thing they long for is also what terrifies them most. They recognize they're lucky because of your combination of qualities they've never found in one person: emotional intelligence, patience, strength, understanding, capacity for depth, ability to see them clearly. The avoidant has encountered people with some of these qualities, but never all in one person. Someone might be patient, but lack emotional intelligence. Someone might see them clearly, but lack patience with their patterns. Someone might have capacity for depth, but lack the strength to maintain boundaries. But you have the full package. All the qualities that make you not just a good partner, but specifically a good partner for someone with their wounds and their patterns. The avoidant recognizes that this combination is exceptionally rare, that they're unlikely to find this again, that having all of these qualities in one person who is also willing to be with them despite their limitations is an extraordinary stroke of luck. The specific trauma and fear patterns that make staying impossible despite feeling lucky. The avoidant person's recognition that they're lucky to have you, while genuine, is overridden by specific trauma responses and fear patterns that make staying with you feel impossible, regardless of their intellectual awareness of your value. Understanding these specific barriers reveals why feeling lucky isn't sufficient to enable them to maintain the relationship and why their trauma is stronger than their conscious recognition of good fortune. Their early childhood trauma created a belief that being loved leads to abandonment, making your love feel like a prelude to inevitable loss rather than like security. The avoidant learned in childhood that people who are supposed to love them, parents, caregivers, are inconsistent, unavailable, or abandon them emotionally or physically. This creates a deep conditioning where love and abandonment are linked in their nervous system. When you love them, when you show care and commitment, their trauma response isn't to feel secure, but to feel impending doom. You love them now, but you'll leave eventually like everyone else did. The love is just a temporary condition before the inevitable abandonment. This trauma-based expectation makes staying with you feel like waiting for the painful ending they believe is coming, and leaving first feels safer than staying and being left. The trauma overrides their recognition that you're different, that you're reliable, that you're committed, because trauma operates at a pre-rational level that doesn't respond to evidence or to conscious awareness. Their attachment wounds created a terror of being truly known and subsequently rejected, making the very depth of understanding you provide feel like a threat rather than a gift. The avoidant learned that showing their true self, expressing needs, being vulnerable leads to rejection or to being hurt. When you see their authentic self beneath their defenses, your clear seeing triggers their deepest fear. Now that you know who they really are, the rejection is coming. They believe at a core level that their true self is unacceptable, and your seeing their true self means you'll eventually recognize how damaged or defective they are and will leave. This makes the understanding you provide, which intellectually they recognize as a rare gift, feel emotionally like an exposure that will lead to rejection. The depth of your understanding triggers their trauma about being known, making staying with someone who sees them so clearly feel unbearably dangerous, regardless of how rationally they understand you're not rejecting what you see. Their trauma around dependence makes the emotional significance you've gained in their life feel like a dangerous vulnerability that must be escaped. The avoidant learned that depending on people leads to being hurt. Depending on a parent who was inconsistent, depending on a caregiver who wasn't reliably available, depending on someone who ultimately abandoned them or hurt them. This created a defensive strategy of not depending on anyone, of maintaining self-sufficiency as protection. But with you, despite their defenses, you've become important. You matter. They depend on you emotionally in ways they don't usually allow themselves to depend on anyone. This dependence triggers their trauma response. Depending on you means you have power to hurt them, means they're vulnerable to your potential abandonment, means they're not safe because their well-being is tied to your continued presence. This makes staying with you feel like maintaining a dangerous vulnerability, and leaving feels like restoring self-protective independence, even though they intellectually recognize losing you will hurt. Their fear of engulfment makes the intimacy you create feel like a threat to their identity and their autonomy rather than like the connection they desire. The avoidant sense of self is fragile and is maintained through rigid boundaries and defended independence. They fear that intimacy means losing themselves, being consumed by another person's needs and expectations, having their identity erased through merger with a partner. When you create genuine intimacy, when the relationship develops depth and closeness, their engulfment fear activates. They start feeling like they're losing themselves, like they can't breathe, like they're being swallowed by the relationship. This makes staying feel like continued loss of self, like slow suffocation, like sacrificing their identity. The closeness that you create, which they intellectually recognize as healthy intimacy, feels viscerally like a threat to their very existence, triggering a flight response that overrides their recognition of your value. Their conditioned association between vulnerability and pain makes every moment of emotional openness with you feel like setting themselves up to be hurt. The avoidant learned through painful experiences that vulnerability leads to pain. Sharing feelings led to those feelings being dismissed or used against them. Expressing needs led to those needs being rejected or punished. Showing weakness led to being hurt or taken advantage of. This conditioning makes vulnerability with you, despite your trustworthiness, feel like a dangerous risk. Every time they're vulnerable with you, even though you respond well, their nervous system is bracing for pain, expecting hurt, anticipating that their vulnerability will be punished. This constant state of fear during vulnerable moments makes staying with you, which requires ongoing vulnerability, feel like perpetual anxiety and threat, making escape feel like relief, even though they recognize you are the person who makes vulnerability safer than it's ever been. Their trauma-based expectation that good things don't last makes the positive aspects of the relationship with you feel temporary rather than sustainable, creating a preemptive ending to avoid eventual loss. The avoidant learned that good things in their life are temporary, that happiness doesn't last, that positive experiences end badly. This creates an expectation that the relationship with you, despite being good, will eventually deteriorate or end painfully. Rather than enjoying the positive relationship while it lasts, they're constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, expecting things to go wrong, anticipating the ending. This makes staying feel like prolonging inevitable disappointment, and leaving first feels like controlling the ending rather than being blindsided by it. Their recognition that they're lucky to have you is overshadowed by their trauma-based certainty that this luck won't last, making preemptive escape feel safer than staying and risking the painful ending they believe is inevitable. Their deep shame about themselves makes them believe they don't deserve you, that staying with you is a fraud that will eventually be discovered. The avoidant carries profound shame about who they are, shame about their wounds, their patterns, their perceived inadequacy. When they recognize they're lucky to have you, part of their response is a shame-based belief that they don't deserve this luck, that you're too good for them, that staying with you is somehow fraudulent because someone as damaged as them shouldn't have someone as good as you. This creates an expectation that the fraud will be discovered, that you'll eventually realize they're not worthy of you and will leave and leaving first feels like escaping before the shameful revelation of their inadequacy, rather than staying and having their unworthiness exposed through your eventual rejection. Their nervous system's conditioning to interpret love and closeness as danger creates a physiological response that makes staying literally feel unbearable in their body. The avoidance trauma isn't just cognitive or emotional, it's physiological. Their nervous system has been conditioned through repeated experiences to interpret closeness and love as a threat. When you love them, when you're close to them, their nervous system activates stress responses, elevated heart rate, anxiety, feeling of not being able to breathe, desire to flee. These are involuntary physiological responses that don't respond to their intellectual recognition that you're safe and they're lucky to have you. Their body is telling them they're in danger when they're close to you, and this physiological message is more powerful than their cognitive awareness. Staying with you means fighting against their own nervous system's danger signals every day, making leaving feel like physiological relief, even though intellectually they know it's a mistake. How the contradiction between feeling lucky and being unable to stay destroys them. The avoidant person experiences profound internal destruction from the contradiction between recognizing they're lucky to have you and being unable to overcome their trauma and fears sufficiently to stay with you. Understanding how this contradiction destroys them reveals both their suffering and the tragic waste of their awareness without corresponding capacity. The contradiction destroys them by creating cognitive dissonance between what they know intellectually and what they feel viscerally, forcing ongoing mental torment. The avoidant knows you're exceptional, knows they're fortunate, knows they should stay, knows leaving is a mistake, but their feelings, the anxiety, the suffocation, the fear, the urge to flee, contradict what they know. This creates an impossible internal state where their intellect is saying one thing and their emotions are saying the opposite thing, where their awareness of your value exists alongside their inability to tolerate closeness with you. The constant tension between knowing they should stay and feeling they must leave creates mental torture that doesn't resolve regardless of which choice they make. If they stay, they're fighting their nervous system and their trauma every day. If they leave, they're living with the knowledge they destroyed something they recognize as valuable. The contradiction destroys them by making them feel fundamentally broken in ways they cannot deny or defend against, forcing a confrontation with the extent of their damage. When the avoidant recognizes they're lucky to have you but still cannot stay, it proves to them something is fundamentally wrong with them. They cannot blame you. You're exceptional. They cannot claim the relationship wasn't right. They recognize it was exactly what they needed. They're forced to confront that the problem is them, their trauma, their damage, their dysfunction. This recognition of their own brokenness is devastating because it removes the defensive narratives that usually protect their self-image. They cannot tell themselves they left because the person wasn't right or the relationship wasn't working. They have to acknowledge they destroyed a good relationship because they're too damaged to sustain it, and this self-knowledge is crushing to their sense of themselves. The contradiction destroys them by creating profound shame about being so traumatized that they destroy what they recognize as valuable, compounding their existing shame with new evidence of their inadequacy. The avoidant already carries deep shame about their wounds and their patterns, but recognizing they're lucky to have you while being unable to stay adds a new layer of shame. They're not just damaged from childhood, they're so damaged that they destroy relationships they intellectually recognize as exactly what they need. This proves their dysfunction is severe enough to override their awareness and their desires, severe enough to make them destroy their own chances at happiness. This shame about the severity of their damage, about being the person who recognizes good fortune while being unable to accept it, is devastating and reinforces their core belief that they're fundamentally defective. The contradiction destroys them by eliminating hope that future relationships might work, since they couldn't make it work even with a person who was ideal for their wounds. The avoidant might have maintained hope that with a different person, with the right person, a relationship could work. But you were the right person. You had the understanding, the patience, the emotional intelligence, the capacity to work with their patterns. If they couldn't make it work with you, if even with an ideal partner, their trauma and fears were too strong to overcome, then what hope is there for future relationships? This recognition eliminates hope, creates despair about ever being capable of sustaining a relationship, and creates resignation to remaining alone. Because if they couldn't stay with someone they recognize as lucky to have, they cannot stay with anyone. The contradiction destroys them by creating lasting regret that intensifies over time as they recognize they'll never find what they had with you again. When the avoidant leaves despite feeling lucky, the regret is immediate and intense. But it gets worse over time rather than better, as they attempt other connections and discover everyone falls short, as they recognize what you provided truly was rare and irreplaceable, as they understand they destroyed something they'll spend the rest of their life looking for and never finding. This growing regret becomes heavier over years, becomes a central feature of their psychological landscape, becomes evidence of the catastrophic mistake they made despite knowing better. And this lasting regret destroys their capacity for peace or for contentment because they're always aware of what they lost despite recognizing its value. The contradiction destroys them by proving their trauma is more powerful than their awareness or their will, forcing a recognition of their own powerlessness. The avoidant might have believed that awareness was sufficient, that recognizing your value and their patterns would enable them to choose differently, that understanding would give them control. But the contradiction proves otherwise. They're not in control. Their trauma is more powerful than their awareness. Their conditioning overrides their will. Their nervous system defeats their intentions. This recognition of powerlessness in the face of their own trauma is terrifying and defeating because it means they cannot trust themselves to make good choices, even when they know what the good choice is, cannot rely on their own agency to build the life they want, and cannot overcome their damage through insight or through trying harder.